So metrics are important because they allow us to quantify our results. There are different types of metrics, and I am going to talk about these two main types of metrics. So one type is what we call behavioral, and the other type is attitudinal. When it comes to behavioral, and I am giving some examples here that I'm sure probably most of you are familiar with. We're talking about page views, abandonment rate, task success, task completion time, conversion rate. So these are all behavioral data. And why are these behavioral metrics? Because they are based on the user's behavior. So these are things that the users are actually doing. And they can do this in real time, and we can use analytics to understand this. So it's actually the real context of how they use a website or how they use an app. And it can also be done within a lab environment when we do usability testing as well. So we can really understand how these users are behaving, even though it's important to understand both contexts, both within the lab environment, but also in a real environment. And also besides analytics, there are other very interesting softwares like Hotjar, for example. It allows us to actually see the recordings of the sessions, but basically this is all about the behavior.
I love using Hotjar too and observing how people are going through the site and what frustrations they might have just by like seeing their mouse and like going up and down and scrolling around the page. It's so interesting, and I feel like it definitely is that next step beyond just analytics to help you discover the sort of the why, or that go towards a little bit more towards the attitudinal, perhaps to start having some hypotheses around those behaviors.
It's amazing. Yes, I love it. Right. So we also have the attitudinal. So when it comes to attitudinal, so we are talking more about the attitude. In psychology, attitude and behavior, it's often not the same. And what I mean is often it doesn't match. So sometimes we have certain beliefs or certain attitudes and they don't really match the behavior. So we can say something and actually your users might be as honest as possible, but it doesn't mean it will actually match the behavior. It's one of the very, let's say, unique ways to measure things, for example, like happiness. Like how do we know if our users are happy or not? It's really difficult. We actually need to ask them. So these are some very common scales as well, like the Net Promoter Score. I'm sure everyone knows the customer satisfaction score as well, which is a bit more short term, but it's still a measure of trying to understand the satisfaction of the customer. And then we also have some that are more used within the usability testing context, such as the SUQ, the single is question. And we actually ask the user how difficult, how easy was this task for you? So we are actually trying to understand the perception of our users. So that's attitude, not as much as behavior, because we can see that they are taking less time or not actually completing a task. But here we are actually asking them. So that's attitude.
I always think of attitudinal as more like qualitative data. And I think about it like more about the feeling, not just measuring like if a task is accomplished, but the feelings about that task and how someone experienced it. And like you said, whether they're happy about it, whether they're not, we're able to really gauge a lot more than what we see through this type of data. And I really like that. This is kind of my favorite sort of data to gather is, why and really understand people from that perspective.
Absolutely, yes. Actually, this is so true. Like, it's a lot about qualitative, and this is why it's maybe one of the most difficult to measure. And sometimes for us, even like a team, it's really difficult for us to be able to interpret that data. And that's why we try to have this kind of score, like this type of metric that it allows us to say, okay, this person rated like a 5, for example, and now they're rating a 7. So it's really interesting.
I think like with happiness, sometimes what we haven't sort of talked about as well is is just being observant of people's reactions. And so sometimes, you know, you'll just record someone's face while you're testing with them, and you can either, there could be a third party that's observing their facial reactions, or if you've recorded it, you can go back and observe sort of their mannerisms, and you can measure it by, like, you know, sometimes people say they like something, but you instinctively maybe feel that they may not have actually liked it. So there's kind of like a third aspect to it that I found is, and actually I just did a test for Adobe recently where I was testing out a new product idea with their partners, and so in one aspect I had to gauge whether or not they really actually were interested in this product, not just by their words, but their expressions and their reactions. So that was like an interesting thing that sometimes it's overlooked as well. Sometimes is really reading people.
It's so important. Yeah, I completely agree. Like, it's really important. It's also a disadvantage of, let's say, self-reported data. So, for example, when we ask someone like to rate from a scale to 1 to 10, we are just measuring exactly like the attitude, what they think, or even like you said, if they know you, maybe it's not really what they think, it's more what they want you to hear. So bias is really important to take that in consideration, and I think it's really interesting, that approach. And I'm also going to mention that so metrics are not everything as well. Like, we do need to take in consideration other things and do that combination, because otherwise there is room for bias. Exactly. I love that example. Yeah.